Kenneth McGriff, better known as Supreme or Preme, was one of the most influential kingpins in the history of New York City. Throughout his career as a drug lord, he would become well known for founding and leading the notorious Supreme Team, a 200-strong organization of vicious criminals who operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and sold over 25,000 vials of illegal substances per week, making over $500,000 per day during their peak. After one of his stash houses was raided in the mid-'80s, Preme would find himself in prison for the first time. However, this wouldn't stop him from directing his organization, which he continued to do behind bars with the help of his second-in-command, the notoriously brutal Gerald Prince Miller. When McGriff was released in 1987, the Supreme Team entered its golden years, capitalizing on the split epidemic of the 80s and becoming one of the most powerful dope crews in New York City history. But once again, Supreme wound up in prison on a Kingpin charge, which marked the beginning of the end for the Supreme Team, as Prince's vicious leadership methods drew too much attention from law enforcement, resulting in the arrest and conviction of over 100 Supreme Team members. Once released from his second prison stint, McGriff tried to walk away from the street life and turn to the entertainment business. After writing the script for Crime Partners, a movie that featured major rappers such as Ice-T and Snoop Dogg, Preme began making his name in the entertainment business, with Murder Inc. founder Irv Gotti even offering him a position as vice president of the record label. Unfortunately, Preme had a major fallout with Eric Smith, aka E Moneybags, which led him to put out a hit on Smith's head, in which he ordered his hitman to record the hit for his later enjoyment. This would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. Years later, authorities would find the video of the hit and convict him of a life sentence, which he is currently serving at USP McCrary in Pine Knot, Kentucky. Infamously known for ordering the hit on 50 Cent, McGriff's career as a kingpin was riddled with addiction to the street life, which ultimately cost him his freedom. This is his story. Kenneth McGriff was born in the South Jamaica neighborhood in Queens, New York, on September 19, 1960. Although most criminals come from broken homes, McGriff came from a very different home environment. He was the middle child in a decent, middle-class, blue-collar family. Both of his parents were transit workers for the city, and in the time that McGriff was growing up, South Jamaica was still known as a family-friendly neighborhood. Originally considered a slum in the early 20th century, South Jamaica, or Southside Jamaica, as many residents would refer to it in the 50s, the neighborhood underwent a series of urban transformations under the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the early 1940s. The idea was to turn South Jamaica from a slum into a middle-class neighborhood, but the project ultimately failed, and the neighborhood remained one of the poorest areas of Queens. Due to the increased felony rate that afflicted the neighborhood in the late 70s and 80s as a result of the dope trade, the area would come to be nicknamed by residents as South Suicide Jamaica. But this wouldn't be until later in McGriff's life. Considering his relatively ordinary background growing up in the Baisley Park housing projects, it can be difficult to understand how exactly Kenneth McGriff ended up becoming one of the most notorious drug lords in the streets of New York City. McGriff's involvement in the streets began during his formative years at Catherine and Count Basie Junior High School, where he was described by his peers and school faculty as handsome, extremely athletic, and intelligent. He was a talented football player and even had dreams of going to college on a football scholarship, but ultimately, his negative influences and poor choices led him down the dark path of street life. McGriff's high school years were marked by his introduction to a black nationalist Islamic sect called the 5 Percenters, a group that was founded on the belief that 5% of the African American population was destined to rule the rest of the world. Although McGriff wouldn't become formally involved with the 5 Percenters until after leaving Catherine and Court Basie Junior High School, being exposed to their ideas at a young age had a deep effect on him, and would ultimately shape some of his most important life choices later on. With college on the horizon and the possibility of living an ordinary, legitimate lifestyle becoming increasingly likely by the day, McGriff realized that he had an important choice to make. If he were to continue with school, it was very likely that he would end up working a similar job as his parents, working every day for the rest of his life to make ends meet. He had more than one reason to be mistrustful of the system, as racialism and the systematic oppression of the Black community were both very real problems in American society, especially in New York. Even if he decided to go to college, it would have been very difficult for McGriff to become anything but a blue-collar worker. On the other hand, McGriff realized that some of the most successful men he had been in contact with were street hustlers. After all, in McGriff's environment, the men who were driving the nicest cars, dating the most beautiful women, and throwing the best parties were usually involved in organized crime in one way or another. Terrified of the idea of dedicating his entire life to low-paying manual work, McGriff dropped out of high school in the 1970s and turned instead to a life of crime. Of course, even as a hustler, McGriff had to start somewhere and worked his way from the bottom up. Although he had his sights set on becoming the king of the streets, his beginnings in the criminal world were as ordinary as can be. With no other connections in the crime world yet, McGriff decided to become a member of the Five Percenters. It's important to note that although the teachings and belief of the Five Percenters fundamentally revolved around doing good in the world and helping to enlighten others through their evangelization efforts, there were several subgroups inside the movement that would use the teachings of the group as a cover-up to facilitate their criminal activities. In the 70s and 80s, the criminally oriented Five Percenters will become one of the most problematic criminal groups for the NYPD, as they exerted a lot of power in the streets and practically every jail throughout the city. They would frequently have run-ins with the FBI, and they influenced virtually every aspect of street and gang life in every borough of New York City. It was during his time in the Five Percenters that McGriff got his nickname. In the movement, he was referred to as the Supreme. It was also around that time that Supreme was introduced by a fellow Five Percenter to local Kingpin Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, who would go on to have a major influence on Supreme's life. In those times, heroin was the most commonly sold dope on the streets, and the Five Percenters constantly fought against rival gang, the Seven Crowns, for power, money, influence, and territory in the dope slinging game. However, this all changed a few years later. In the early 1980s, coke was quickly becoming the dope of choice in low-income communities all over New York City. As the use of the illegal substance became more and more widespread, local dealers saw this as an opportunity to enter a whole new market. Because the coke epidemic hadn't yet made headlines in the media, dealers could make enormous profits selling massive quantities of the dope without the police noticing. Being the natural businessman that he was, Supreme saw this opportunity and immediately took action. Branching off from the Five Percenters, Supreme formed his own team, aptly named the Supreme Team. McGriff's team would go on to become one of the most notorious crews in New York City history. From its founding, the Supreme Team was structured like a legitimate business organization, with Supreme at the top of the pyramid. Although he was a highly competent businessman, running a criminal crew of more than 200 people was a task that no man could handle alone, which is why Supreme recruited his nephew, Gerald Prince Miller, and made him his second in command. The two complemented each other very well. While Supreme was widely known as the brilliant business mind that made the gears of the organization turn, Prince was known to be a vicious, merciless ruffian. Although he commonly resorted to extreme methods of brutality to assert his dominance in the street, he was always completely loyal to Supreme and the organization. As for McGriff, it was well known in the streets of New York that he only resorted to brutality when it was absolutely necessary and there was no other way out of the situation. Otherwise, he preferred to keep the heat off of himself and his crew and avoid drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement. At the peak of the organization's history, there was more than 200 members operating under Prince and Supreme. Among the members of the Supreme Team were big street names such as Wilfredo Arroyo, aka C Just, Harry Big C Hunt, and the notorious Waverly Teddy Coleman. These members and many more reported up the ladder to Prince and Supreme, who did everything he could to make the Supreme team run as smoothly as possible and out of sight of law enforcement. As the operations of the team were based out of the Baisley Park houses in South Jamaica, McGriff arranged an elaborate security system around the projects, assigning lookouts equipped with walkie-talkies to keep watch from the top of nearby buildings if law enforcement officers ever entered the area. The Supreme Team security team would alert the traitors, who would then hide or destroy all incriminating evidence. In the early 1980s, the Supreme Team was moving insane amounts of narcotics. As he continued to scale his team's operations, Supreme leveraged the old network connections he had made in high school and established a mutually beneficial business partnership with Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. At the time, Fat Cat was one of the biggest black dealers in NYC, and he quickly became the Supreme Team's main coke supplier. Because the coke epidemic was not in the media spotlight and the Supreme Team wasn't in the sight of the NYPD just yet, the crew enjoyed an uninterrupted streak of freedom in which they operated with little to no police intervention. This allowed Supreme, or Preme, as many would call him, to smoothly scale his operation. But if the Supreme Team knew how to work hard, they also knew how to play harder. At their peak, the team operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, selling more than 25,000 vials of coke per week, and reached a revenue of about $500,000 every single day. Like most criminals, the crew couldn't help but shamelessly boast their dirty money. Every member of the Supreme Team had flashy cars and beautiful women surrounding them, and they would often throw large parties where they would hire rappers in groups as big as Run DMC and the Beastie Boys. Ultimately, this is what made the NYPD take notice of the Supreme Team. And by 1985, the FBI had started tapping their phones and surveying their operations from a distance. This was the year in which an article in the New York City Times describing coke use in the Bronx, titled "A New Purified Form of Coke Causes Alarm as Abusers Increase," gained massive traction, which put the spotlight on people like Preme. Over the next year, more than 1,000 articles will be published by different media outlets describing the now infamous dope epidemic. One day in 1985, members of a rival gang robbed one of Supreme's stash houses and took about $80,000 cash, as well as a large quantity of dope. Enraged, Preme put out a frightening notice, letting everyone know that if he didn't get his dope and money back, he would take action. When the police got knowledge of this in September of that same year, they organized a series of raids on a lot of Supreme Team stash houses. In one of the raids, which took place on September 10th, they found Preme and other members of his crew flushing large quantities of coke down the toilet, as well as large quantities of dope and paraphernalia lying around the stash houses. Preme was guilty of narcotic possession and sentenced to 9 years at Elmira State Prison in New York. At the time, he was only 25 years old, and he expected to get right back in the game as soon as he got out of prison. In the interest of keeping his organization growing, he placed the Supreme Team under the leadership of Prince. Through his leadership, dozens of people were tortured, beaten, and assassinated. This could have gone on for a much longer time, but Preme ended up getting released from prison in August of 1987, just 2 years into his sentence. It has been alleged that as soon as he got out of prison, every member of his crew gave him a welcome home gift in the form of bags filled with thousands of dollars. After being brought up to speed on the organization's operations and communicating his vision for the future of the Supreme Team to the crew, Preme got back to work. Over the next few months, the crew organized sporting and music events for their community and set up youth sports programs all over Queens, showing a much more generous side of the organization. The team also organized food drives and charitable events for the less privileged members of the Queens community. However, the illegal operations didn't stop during this time, and just 3 months after being released from prison, Preme was once again arrested when the NYPD raided another one of his stash houses. The judge that handled the case was a black man from Queens named Sterling Johnson, who had seen the physical damages the Supreme Team had been involved in and how they had destroyed the neighborhood he lived in. As a result, he sentenced Preme to 12 years in prison on charges of operating a continually criminal enterprise. Once again, Preme left Prince in charge of the organization, which once again turned the Supreme Team into an extremely dangerous organization. In 1987, Prince ordered 8 homicides, sometimes even assassinating members of his own team who he deemed unloyal. The first of these offenses that he was formally framed of was the execution of a 19-year-old dealer who was shot once in the head at point-blank range on August 21, 1987, in the South Jamaica neighborhood. However, the jury eventually found Prince not guilty due to insufficient proof, and he was acquitted. On July 13, 1990, while he was in jail for the first homicide, another set of assassination charges came back to haunt Prince. This time, it was a quadruple homicide of 4 Colombian suppliers. The Queens District Attorney's Office said Prince ordered the hit from prison and that he was operating his empire by using code words on the phone to direct members of his organization. Of this set of homicides, District Attorney John Stantucci said they were handcuffed, gagged, strangled, and then they bashed their skulls. Once again, Prince ended up getting acquitted. For several months, police were unable to make any of these charges stick, which resulted in many different newspapers giving Prince the nickname Mr. Untouchable. Although he was able to get away with a whole series of criminal activities for several years, that same year, Prince was sent to prison on a state homicide charge thanks to the testimony of several eyewitnesses. With both of the leaders in jail, the organization was temporarily disbanded on Supreme's orders. They were inactive from 1987 to 1989. And during this time, something happened that changed the New York City dope world forever. On February 26, 1988, 22-year-old rookie police officer Edward Byrne was conducting a stakeout in South Jamaica after a Guyanese immigrant had repeatedly called the police to tip them off about possible gang activity going on in the area. Suddenly, a car with 4 male passengers pulled up behind him. 2 of the men got out, and one of them shot Byrne in the face 5 times with the .38 caliber pistol. He passed in the hospital shortly after. The homicide sparked nationwide outrage, and President Ronald Reagan himself called Mr. Byrne's family to offer his condolences. It's not an overstatement to say that the passing of Edward Byrne officially triggered the conflict on dope in New York City. Shortly after his passing, the NYPD launched a Tactical Narcotics Team, or TNT, which consisted of 117 members dedicated to bringing down local dealers and prosecuting them to the fullest extent of the law. A little over a year later, in the spring of 1989, Prince was released from jail after an eyewitness changed their testimony about what happened on the night of one of the homicides Prince was framed of. Although he was suspected of intimidating the eyewitness into changing their story, this was never formally shown, and he was allowed to walk. Prince's release marked the rebirth of the Supreme Team. Once out of jail, he appointed Wilfredo Arroyo as a second in command and went back to his brutal methods. Under Prince, things were not the same as before for the Supreme Team. Whereas before, they had been raking in over $500,000 a day, they were only making around $10,000 a day after 1989. The NYPD crackdown simply made it impossible to keep scaling as smoothly as they had under McGriff. Things went from bad to worse, and in 1990, Prince and 15 other members of the Supreme Team were apprehended by the police after the NYPD tapped many of the members' phone and monitored over 100 of their conversations, in which they spoke in detail about the team's operations and brutal offenses. Unbeknownst to Prince, the wiretap had taken place between December 1989 and March 1990 and would end up becoming the deciding factor in his demise. He was indicted on 4 homicide charges and several other burglaries and kidnapping charges. Although the wiretaps were illegally placed by the police and the assassinated charges were subsequently dropped, Prince was still sentenced to 7 life sentences in prison in 1993. Other members of the team who ended up in prison as a result of the wiretap included Ronald Tucker, aka Tuck, and Wilfredo Arroyo, aka C-Just. who were sentenced to 14 years and 3 life sentences respectively. This marked the official downfall of the Supreme team in 1995. Preme himself was released on parole after serving 8 years in prison on the Kingpin charge. By that point, however, over 100 members of the original team had been arrested, and it became clear to McGriff that he could no longer continue with business as usual. In addition to this, McGriff has spent many of his waking hours in prison reading and educating himself, and decided to reform his life when he got out of prison. This is when he turned his attention to the entertainment industry. Shortly after his release, he linked up with Irving Lorenzo Jr., a producer also known as DJ Irv. Together, they started the label Murder Inc., which would go on to become a legitimate force in the world of hip-hop in New York City. Eventually, DJ Irv rebranded himself as Irv Gotti and offered McGriff the role of vice president at Murder Inc. This was a major turning point in Supreme's life, as accepting the offer could have solidified him as a legitimate business mogul. Shockingly, he rejected the offer out of pride. When Irv Gotti asked him why he didn't want to accept, Supreme simply replied, "Because I wouldn't be Preme." Nonetheless, Preme continued to be involved with Murder Inc., and he eventually became interested in making movies. In 2001, he released a movie adaptation of Dolan Goen's novel, Crime Partners, which featured Snoop Dogg, Ice-T, and other famous rappers. Even though it was alleged that Crime Partners had been financed with dope money, the movie made about $4 million, and Preme began to build a reputation in the entertainment industry. Sadly, he couldn't stay away from the streets, and several sources claim that he was moving large quantities of dope in secret in New York City. Preme would once again draw unwanted attention from law enforcement after a series of altercations involving another hustler who wanted to leave the streets behind and join the entertainment industry, Eric Smith, better known as E Moneybags. As the story goes, Moneybags wanted to purchase a car from Supreme and gave his crew the money for it. Shortly after, he changed his mind before receiving the car, but Supreme refused to give him a refund. Feeling cheated and betrayed, E sought out Supreme and found him sitting in the car along with his friend Cobra Black Just Johnson. Moneybags opened fire and accidentally shot Black Just instead of Preme, which led Preme to put a price on his head. In order to protect himself from Preme's wrath, E Moneybags banded with other rappers who shared a similar hatred for Kenneth McGriff. Among these rappers was Curtis Jackson III, better known as 50 Cent. The bad blood between 50 and Preme started in 2000 when 50 Cent was stabbed outside of the Hit Factory Studios in New York after an altercation with Murder Inc.'s rapper, Ja Rule. However, the feud didn't end there. In 2000, 50 Cent released the song Ghetto Quran in a mixtape in which he aired out a lot of hustlers' business for everyone to listen to. Of course, this rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, including Supreme himself. After the song's release, 50 Cent was labeled by many as a snitch, and Supreme was determined to eliminate him. On May 24, 2000, 50 Cent was sitting in his car outside of his grandmother's house in Queens when a car pulled up beside him and a man shot him 9 times in his hand, chest, calf, hip, and face. Miraculously, he survived, but by then it was well known that Supreme had been behind the assassination attempt. 50 identified the trigger man as Daryl Hamo Bomb, who was known for being Mike Tyson's bodyguard. Shortly after the incident, Hamo was assassinated in a gang-related incident. Because the authorities weren't able to gather enough proof to charge him, Supreme continued on a rampage to take out his enemies, the next of which was E Moneybags. In 2001, Preme ordered the hit on E Moneybags and also commanded his hitmen to record the entire incident for his later enjoyment. On July 16th, Moneybags was parked in an SUV in front of a house in New York when 4 hitmen suddenly approached the car wearing white gloves and fired more than 40 times into the vehicle. 50 Cent may have survived 9 shots, but surviving 40 shots is practically impossible, and Eric Smith passed on the spot. Ordering the hit to be recorded would turn out to be the biggest mistake of Preme's life, as police would end up finding it years later. In 2007, Preme was living in Baltimore, Maryland, where he had moved large quantities of dope. While searching his property, police found a recording, and he was later charged with 2 counts on assassination conspiracy in the hit of E Moneybags and another rapper he had put a hit out on. He was accused of paying $50,000 per hit, and in 2007, he began serving his life sentence at ADX Florence, a federal supermax prison in Colorado. In 2011, he was transferred to the United States Penitentiary, Lee, a high-security federal prison in Pennington Gap, Virginia. As of 2021, he is housed at USP McCrary in Pine Knot, Kentucky. Although he had been in prison for 16 years, McGriff is remembered in the streets of New York City as a dominant force in the dope world. The money, power, and respect he and his team commanded for a handful of years became an inspiration to an entire generation of hip-hop artists such as LL Cool J, Nas, and countless others. Unlike many criminals who turn to a life of crime out of need, Preme chose the street life voluntarily and ended up paying very dearly for it. The whole objective for me being in the game was to exit the game, McGriff said in the documentary Supreme Team, which was released in 2022. But as he said in his own words about the street life, something's always gotta drag you back in. In Preme's case, that something was the accumulation of his whole life choices,